Welcome to the Bill Seng Podcast. My name is Bill Seng, and I am here with another episode of the World of Worldview series. So tonight, we're going to be talking about evolution and how evolution fits into the biblical worldview. So the world's perspective on evolution is that it is an undeniable fact, that this is something that cannot be disputed, that it is as much of a law of nature as gravity, as entropy, as any other law of nature. That is the world's perspective on the theory of evolution, on evolution itself. And it is oftentimes said to be backed up by a couple different observations or factors. First of all is, of course, Darwin's famous observation of natural selection. That was Darwin's original theory, was that evolution was driven through natural selection. And natural selection being that essentially the strong survive, that there are genetic variations, there are mutations and things like that that happen. Thus, over time, as these mutations and variations procreate, they create new species of animals, and thus evolution happens over time until the original species is something totally different by the end based on a variety of factors. Another one of the factors, another one of the observations that is believed to drive evolution and is support for evolution is the idea of mutation. As I just mentioned, inside of natural selection, there are anomalous formations inside of the genetic code passed down from one generation to the next generation, that DNA, that the information gets scrambled, and when it gets passed on, well, there you go. You have a new species of organism. There is a very famous study done on bacteria, and it is something that has been of important observation in our day and age, the observation of how antibiotic-resistant bacteria form. And that is oftentimes used to say, you see, you have to make sure to take all of an antibiotic before the bacteria can evolve into an antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So we'll talk more about that. The Miller-Urey experiment. This is one that happened a long time ago that was conducted by Stanley Miller. And what they claim to do is to recreate the initial conditions of a younger version of Earth, a primordial Earth, and that supposedly they got the building blocks of life to form out of the Miller-Urey experiment. We'll talk about that. Something that I remember going over when I was in biology at the college level was that essentially my professor said that if you want to understand biology, you must understand evolution. You cannot understand biology without understanding evolution. And of course, evolution, not only is it driven through genetic factors, environmental factors, all sorts of factors, it is also required that there are millions of years to allow these changes to get you from, say, the dinosaurs from 65 million years ago all the way up to the finch of today. The claim is that these changes don't just happen overnight, but rather that it needs to happen over a span of very long periods of time. So, the biblical perspective on evolution. First of all, I want to preface this with a couple of books I would like to refer you to. The first one is called The Lie by Ken Ham. You might recognize Ken Ham's name. He is one of the founders of the founder of Answers in Genesis, and his name is also attached to the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter, which is in Kentucky. So Ken Ham wrote a book called The Lie, and it is about how evolution is predicated on a lie, but also it has some very bad consequences if you adopt evolution as a worldview. Another one is The Case for the Creator by Lee Strobel, and it is a very good book. It is Lee Strobel. He is an investigative journalist, and he goes around and he talks to experts about evolution, talks to them to find out, is evolution something that happened? Is it possible? And it's a very remarkable book, and some of the material that I'll be sharing today will be based on his material. And then finally, another one is called Darwin's Black Box. That is by Michael Behe, and you might not have heard of Darwin's Black Box, but I consider it to be a classic in itself. Now, I disagree with Michael Behe on certain things, but what he ends up proving is that evolution could not happen outside of a divine hand guiding it. Now, having said that, what is a biblical worldview on evolution? The biblical worldview on evolution is that evolution did not happen. So you might be asking yourself, Bill, right now you just said that you disagree with Michael Behe on some things, and one of those things, by the way, is that Michael Behe does believe in evolution. And what I have to say, there's an awful lot of Christians that believe in evolution. Again, that's because evolution is taught as a scientific fact, as something that just happens and that we know it happens. We see it happening all over the place. Well, the Bible happens to say otherwise, and a biblical worldview will teach you otherwise. And one of the most important things as we're doing this worldview series is that you stop looking at things from a materialistic, naturalistic perspective, and you start seeing things through the lens of God. So when they make observations and they say that we see evolution happening in front of us, we need to look at the same phenomena that are happening and say, no, that's not what's happening. Through the lens of God's Word, this is what I actually observe happening in this instance. So we're going to read some scripture before we dive into this. As I said, that the theory of evolution in general, is an I would even go as far to say anti-biblical worldview, despite the fact that many Christians and many pastors and many leaders in the side of the church happen to believe it. So to prove this, we're going to go to the book of Genesis. You'll notice I reference the book of Genesis a lot inside this series, particularly Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. So I'm going to go to Genesis chapter 1 right now, and I'm going to read to you verses 20 through 26. Genesis chapter 1, verse 20 says, "And God said, let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea, and every living thing with which the water teems, and that moves about in it, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, be fruitful, and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth. And there is evening, and there is morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So that is the biblical creation account of when God actually created life. Now, looking at it right here, there's no mention whatsoever of evolution. It does not say that, mind you, pay close attention to the language being used. It uses the idea of that they brought forth after their own kind. So what is a kind? Well, a kind is not a species. You might say, well, the Bible says that God created every species, but we don't see that in nature. We don't see that in reality. That's not what the Bible is saying. So when God created, there weren't necessarily like lions and tigers and leopards and cheetahs and all that, but rather he created kinds of animals. And then from them, now mind you, I don't know the genetic history of lions and tigers and leopards and cheetahs, but essentially, from what I'm gathering, that there were basically a cat kind, a big cat kind, perhaps. And from that big cat kind, that's where these different big cats happen to come from, like lions and tigers. In fact, when you look at the fossil record, you happen to see a very fascinating animal that we call the saber-toothed tiger. We don't see saber-toothed tigers around anymore. And from a biblical worldview, that the fossils that we find probably took place prior to the worldwide flood. And because of that, it could be that the saber-toothed tiger was one of the original kinds of animals, one of the original species of the big cat kind. And again, I don't want to say that authoritatively. I really don't know for a fact. But just for an example, we do know that there are extinct species of big cats, and some of these extinct species may have been amongst the original species of big cats inside of the world. We also see that God created them all after their kinds, and we see that he created them very quickly. He did not create them over a span of millions of years, but rather over a span of 2 days, on day 5 and on day 6 of creation. Now, we're going to get a little more into that here shortly, but what I want to do is go into another Bible verse, and we're looking at Genesis chapter 2 now. We're going to read verses 7 and 19. So verse 7 says, "Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being." Now, hold it right there. Some people might read this and say that, doesn't it say that Adam was formed from the dust of the ground? That sounds an awful like that maybe God used evolution, that he evolved him from the ground into a human being. Well, once again, this is something where we do see evidence that mankind is derived from the dirt. But right here, the Bible actually tells us why, because God formed man out of the dirt, not over millions and millions of years, but really quickly, and then he breathed life into him, animating the man on one day of creation. And then in verse 17, we find something else. I believe it's verse 19 rather. We then go on to read, "Now the Lord God had formed out of the ground all the wild animals and all the birds in the sky. He brought them to the man to see what he would name them." So once again, you might say, well, right there it just says he formed all the animals out of the ground. Isn't it possible that God could have evolved all the animals out of the ground and brought them to the man so that he could name them? Once again, the answer is no, because this is the account of when God placed Adam in the Garden of Eden, and he brought all the animals forth, forming them out of the ground so that Adam can name them on that day. And based on my interpretation of Scripture, based on the Genesis 1 creation account, that this all happened in one day. So this happened really fast. And if we want to maintain a biblical worldview, we have to see it that way, that this is not something that took millions of years, but happened very rapidly. So Genesis chapter 9 then, before Genesis chapter 9, I want us then to go to Psalm 100. And this one's a very fascinating psalm. It's Psalm 100, and I'm going to read to you verse 3. And I want to say the part that I want to make you aware of isn't available in every translation of the Bible. I'll read to you the New King, what the New King James Version happens to suggest. Mine is the NIV. And the way the NIV reads in Psalm 103, it says, "Know that the Lord is God. It is he who made us, and we are his." Okay? Now, the alternative version is, "Know that the Lord is God. It is he who made us, and not we ourselves." So what is this saying? It's saying that we did not come about through our own willpower. We did not come about because nature happened to bring us forth, and we're a part of nature, and so nature brought forth. We brought ourselves forth, that we have that power within us. We have that divine essence within us. This is a very sort of pantheistic sort of worldview that would say that, well, we essentially brought ourselves out of the mud. Rather, it's saying that God created us. So it's encouraging us to focus and respect and realize that the Genesis creation account is the true creation account of our origins and of our lives, and thus we should understand Psalm 103 with that understanding. And even if we don't go with this alternative version where it says, "and not we ourselves," where it actually says, "and we are his," the point is still very clear. God created us. God is the creator. He created mankind. We did not evolve from other animals. And so I'm going to go to Genesis 9:6 just to bring out all the more clearly how an evolutionary worldview can contradict the biblical worldview in this regard. So if we turn to Genesis chapter 9, we look at verse 6, And it says, whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind. So you might be asking yourself, how does this have anything to do with mankind not evolving from animals? And by the way, we will do another podcast specifically on mankind and how evolution is not part of a biblical worldview as it pertains to the origins of mankind specifically. But you might be asking yourself, how does murder have anything to do with mankind? Well, if it's not okay for humans to shed one another's blood, and if we all evolved from animals, if we all evolved from an ape-like creature, then would it be murder to kill an ape-like creature? Would it be murder to kill an ape? Would it be murder to kill a chimp? Would it be murder to kill a monkey? Would it be murder to kill anything within our supposed evolutionary tree? And the truth is that no, God does not make that sort of law. He says whoever sheds human blood. So God is stating very clearly, in fact, he even says inside this passage, that mankind is created in the image of God. So there's no mincing words there. It's just true that God created us in his image, and we need to respect that image that we were created in. So God created life according to kinds. Something that is very important for us to understand as far as evolution. For the people that believe that evolution is just a fact and we should just accept it because science has proven it, something that you need to understand, and they teach this, at least I learned this at the college level. And by the way, this was not a Christian college I went to. I went to Cleveland State University, great university. I enjoyed the classes and everything. That I learned inside of that class that the theory of evolution is constantly being revised. There's not just one solid theory of evolution that Darwin came up with, and we just held to it all these decades later, over a century later. Rather, Darwin came up with a theory of evolution, and his theory was that evolution happened through natural selection. You want to know something very funny about that? He was proven wrong, okay? Because evolution, you cannot get origins of life through natural selection. Why is that? Because there's nothing to derive it from the get-go. There's got to be the components of life in order to create life to begin with. And on top of that, it is seen that natural selection is not necessarily, don't get me wrong, I believe that natural selection is a very real phenomenon, but natural selection does not create anything new outside of the existing creature. So Darwin has been proven wrong. In fact, there has been many theories about how things evolve. One of them was heredity. And you might think of that in terms of, well, yeah, heredity. That means, if your dad's bald, then you'll be bald too, right? Well, no, the way that they kind of proposed this idea was that, well, if you have a tall father and a short mother, then you're going to be somewhere in between in terms of your height. That's the type of thing they're talking about. Well, that was proven not true too. You look at, for instance, I can't remember the animal that they say is an ancestor to the giraffe, but they said that, well, this animal that was very horse-like stretched its neck because it wanted to reach the fruit in the tree. And so over a long period of time, as it stretched and stretched and stretched, all of a sudden it could reach the fruit in the tree. And there you go, evolution. Well, even it's funny because the evolutionary community hates that example. They think that it's wrong, and yet they teach it. It's just that they don't teach it over a couple of generations. They teach it over millions of years. They say, you see, eventually that's how the giraffe happened. Over millions of years that this animal found the necessity, and mind you, evolution is supposed to be random chance too. See, it's just full of contradictions all the way through. Darwin, and that's why they keep on revising the theory of evolution, because the theory of evolution cannot stand on its own because it is inherently full of contradictions and problems. So don't think that evolution is an absolute fact. In fact, one of the most trying problems for the theory of evolution is the idea of biogenesis. It's only ever been observed that life comes from life. And as far as the evolution of life and all that, that's a different story, but it's a big roadblock for the theory of evolution right there. So problems with evolution. First of all, as I mentioned, that natural selection is not evolution, okay? I believe in natural selection myself. I think that it's a very real phenomenon. But what natural selection actually is, it has nothing to do with one type of animal turning into another type of animal. In other words, you're not going to get, say, the dinosaurs from supposedly 65 million years ago into a seagull today. Okay, that's not how natural selection works. Rather, what natural selection is that I remember, for instance, one example where there was a certain type of fly that lived in this sort of cavernous area, and it migrated there. I mean, it actually migrated to this area over time, and it was particularly windy. Well, the wind would sweep away these bugs, and it would systematically kill them until there was a mutation where one of the flies happened to lose its wings. And so they ended up crawling, and that was actually more survivable than having their wings in this particular environment. Now, wow, that's evolution right there, right? Well, no, wrong. It actually lost information in order to achieve that phenomenon. And plus, it was still just a fly, even though maybe it'd be a crawl instead because it's not flying. I don't know. Maybe a creeper. I don't know. But regardless, it's not actually evolution in the sense that people want to convince you that it is, because it's not a step forward, it's actually a step backwards, and it's a loss. It's basically more or less if I were to be born without an arm and then my children be born without arms, is that really evolution? Well, no, we're still humans, and that's the bottom line of it. They lost their wings, but they're still flies. That doesn't mean that in millions of years it's going to turn into a crab or a rattlesnake or anything along those lines. It's still just a fly, and it's always going to be the case. Never been observed that natural selection has created a huge genetic transformation. Rather, what it really does, natural selection in the broad sense, is that we all have what's called a genotype. That is what we are on the inside at the genetic level. But then there's a phenotype. And those are our expressed genetics. So you might see that my skin is light. Well, that is phenotype. There's still the possibility that I could have dark-skinned children. Now, it's unlikely. And that's more complicated, but you get it. Light skin, phenotype. But within, we still have the components to produce all sorts of shades of people. And we even see it with people, when a darker-skinned person has a child with a lighter skinned person. Oddly enough, I know even though heredity, the whole heretical, you know what I'm saying, even though that's been all debunked, that ultimately what we do see in those sorts of instances is a sort of middle brown color. And that's the phenotypical makeup. And it's sophisticated, it's complicated. But it's far more complicated than saying that, well, natural selection drives evolution. That's just not the case. One of the prime examples of natural selection driving evolution, again, is the antibiotic-resistant bacteria. The funny thing is this is actually a much better example of exactly the opposite. You see, what happened with the antibiotic-resistant bacteria was not that bacteria was evolving into a new bacteria, but rather what was happening is that the stronger strain of bacteria would occupy an area of the human body, would multiply, and it was strong, and you add antibiotics, and it would kill it off, right? Well, within that strain, there is already a mutated strand that is immune to the antibiotics. There we go. That's what I meant to say. It's already immune to the antibiotics, and it's actually a weaker strain. It's not as strong as the original strain was. And so what happens when the antibiotic is applied, it kills off the strong strain and it allows this weaker strain to survive. Again, it's like a person that's born without arms and legs, essentially. That one actually does survive because the antibiotic cannot affect it, and thus that one starts to multiply and propagate. And that is actually what happens. It's not evolution at work. It is a disadvantageous mutation that happens in that circumstance to work in that bacteria's favor. Once again, what prevents it from being the evolution in the way that the scientific community wants you to think of it? It's still bacteria at the end of the day. It doesn't transform into anything new. It's just a weaker version of the original strain of bacteria. So, a couple of things here. Miller-Urey experiment. I want to touch on that real fast. Funny thing about that is that whole experiment was debunked. I don't know if you still read about it in textbooks or not. It turns out that, first of all, as far as the theoretical composition of the early Earth was concerned, that they got those chemicals and the makeup of the atmosphere wrong. And second of all, even if it wasn't wrong, the products of this experiment were formaldehyde and cyanide, which is basically just embalming fluid. And as soon as they opened up, as soon as it was exposed to air, the proteins frayed. So there was no way that this could ever turn into a living being. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, right now I am breathing in oxygen. So it would be it wouldn't just be unlikely, it'd be impossible for this to turn into anything else. And it's already impossible for it to turn into anything else. It's inanimate. Next thing, evolution is the only way that you can understand biology. Totally not true. I just explained to you through natural selection and the bacteria example, the antibiotic-resistant bacteria, that you don't need to understand evolution in order to understand biology. You have to be able to make observations. You just have to be able to see what's going on in the world around you, inside of organisms, be able to observe genetics and so forth. It has nothing to do with evolution. It has nothing to do with, especially in regards to origins. You don't have nothing regarding origins and evolution should have an influence on how we understand biology. Now, I will say that you can either see biology and understand biology through an evolutionary framework, or you can see biology and understand biology through a biblical framework. And again, this isn't a matter of what you are actually seeing. This is a matter of how you are interpreting it, which is totally different. Next thing, the millions of years idea, the idea that change happens slowly over millions and millions of years. First of all, I see articles every now and then that pop up to say that, well, evolution happens a lot faster than what we thought. Well, there's a theory called punctuated equilibrium. I bet you didn't know there's multiple different theories of evolution in existence today. And one of them is punctuated equilibrium, which is a theory that came about because they say that it takes millions of years, slow changes over millions of years for something to evolve into something else. And the person that came up with the theory of punctuated equilibrium said that that's not what the geological record shows at all. That rather it looks like it is a long period of time, seemingly unchanged, and then all of a sudden a drastic change in a short amount of time. Now again, I don't believe in any of this stuff, but it's showing that there are contradicting theories inside of the grander theory of evolution. So what is it? Slow changes over millions of years, or is it a fast change in a very brief period of time? Okay, if evolution isn't true, what about homology? The fact that you find lots of similar structures inside of humans, inside of fish, inside of horses, and so on and so forth. You might have seen, the whole thing about like the anatomy of the hand compared to different appendages inside of these different animals I just named off. Well, it's not a sign of evolution that we have a common origin, a common ancestor, but that we have a common creator. So this is pretty straightforward. For instance, we share, not necessarily structurally speaking, but in terms of our genetics, we share an awful lot in common with plants. Well, does that mean that we evolved from plants? Well, no, absolutely not. What we know from the food that we eat is that when we eat, we actually need food that has what we are made of inside of it. And what does the Bible tell us? This is so exciting and so cool, is that the Bible tells us that God created the plants as food for all living beings from the beginning. What does that mean? It means that plants have to have what our bodies need. They have to have what our bodies are made out of. And so it's incredible to see that that's exactly how God designed the plants, is to have everything that our bodies need in order to survive. So you can either look at it from the evolutionary worldview of nature red in tooth and claw, survival of the fittest, or you can look at it that creation is beautiful and has a good design by a good designer that had good intentions for his creation. And then finally, I want to just touch briefly on the idea of irreducible complexity. This is what Michael Behe wrote his book, Darwin's Black Box, on, and it is an incredible book. I highly encourage you to read it. Even though Behe ultimately believes in evolution, he sees that there's no way it could have happened outside of God directing it. Once again, I do not believe in evolution. I do not believe it's a biblical worldview. But what his argument ultimately is that there are structures and creatures and organelles and so forth that are so complex that certain structures within them would have to evolve at exactly the same time, working together as they evolve in order for them to exist. And if that doesn't happen, the organism cannot exist. And there's other nuances to this theory as well, and I think that it's a very well proven theory. Actually, he goes over the ciliary flagellum, I think it is. I can't remember exactly. It's been a long time since I read the book, but ultimately, what it is more or less kind of it looks like a machine inside of this organelle, and it's absolutely incredible how it fits together and it operates. It operates just like the way a machine would work. And if you took one piece out, it would not function as effectively. It would not evolve by chance. It had to be something that was intentionally designed. And so there's all sorts of evidence for creation out there in the world. And irreducible complexity, I think, is one of the strongest points to be made without going in depth in terms of what the Bible has to say directly. So the evidence exists. The evidence is all over the place. You just have to go animal by animal and see just how beautifully and wonderfully made that it is. So I'd like to thank you so much for joining me for today's podcast, which again was on evolution and on a biblical worldview on evolution, which I guess it kind of was almost an oxymoron, because the biblical perspective on evolution is that evolution just isn't true. That we need to pay attention to observations like natural selection and so forth and understand those in the proper light. But ultimately, God created all of life, and that he created them after their kinds, and thus they can produce after their kinds, like dogs. All dogs probably had a common ancestor, which was a dog, but there is a great variety of dogs in the world. So thank you for joining me tonight. I'm Bill Seng. This is Bill Seng Podcast. Join me again for our next episode of World of Worldview.